The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late April of 1882, and Jennie Garrison read it 3 times before she allowed herself to believe that her uncle had actually died and left her something worth traveling 600 miles for. She stood in the narrow kitchen of her rented room in St. Louis, the paper trembling slightly in her fingers, not from grief exactly, because Uncle Harold had been a stranger to her most of her 24 years, but from the particular shock of being handed an unexpected future when you had not been expecting one at all. The letter was from a lawyer in Caldwell, Kansas, a Mr. Thomas Fitch, who wrote in the careful, looping penmanship of a man who charged by the hour and wanted you to know it. He informed her that Harold Garrison had passed on March the 9th, that he had left behind a homestead of 160 acres outside the town of Millhaven, that the land included a farmhouse, a barn, a creek that ran true through summer, and a field of winter wheat that would need tending if it was to be harvested come July. He informed her further that, as the only surviving blood relation, the property was hers to do with as she pleased, including the option to sell, provided she appeared in person to sign the necessary papers within 90 days. Jennie set the letter down on the kitchen table and looked at the wall in front of her. The wall had a watercolor painting of a mill on it that belonged to her landlady. She had looked at that painting every morning for 2 years without really seeing it. She saw it now. She saw exactly how small and fixed it was, how the painted water never moved, how the painted wheel turned in no wind, and she thought that she had perhaps been living like something painted herself. She gave her landlady notice the next morning. She booked passage by train to Wichita, and from Wichita she arranged to travel the remaining distance by coach, because the railroad had not yet stretched its iron fingers all the way to Millhaven, a fact that the lawyer's letter had mentioned in a tone that suggested he considered this a civic failing of some magnitude. The coach ride took the better part of 2 days, rattling and lurching across a landscape that grew broader and quieter with every mile, until the sky above her seemed less like sky and more like a presence, something enormous that pressed gently down on the tall grass, and the low-rolling hills with an intimacy she had never felt between sky and earth in the city. Millhaven announced itself with a water tower, then a grain elevator, then a main street of perhaps 12 storefronts and a church whose white paint was coming off in wide, curling strips. The coach stopped in front of the general store. Jennie climbed out with her 2 traveling cases and her hat slightly crooked from the journey, and she stood in the dusty street and breathed air that tasted of prairie grass and horse, and something sweetly chemical that she could not identify, until she realized it was the smell of raw lumber from a building being framed at the far end of the block. Mr. Fitch's office was above the barber shop. He was a small, precise man with a watch chain, and an apology in his eyes that suggested he had been dealing with grieving relatives long enough to have grown genuinely sorry about it. He walked her through the paperwork with patience, and explained that the property was about 4 miles south and east of town, that the wheat her uncle had planted in the fall was coming along well from what he had heard, that she would need someone who knew the land to help her manage the harvest if she intended to see any return on it. "Your uncle had an arrangement," Mr. Fitch said, folding his hands on his desk, "with a man named Monroe, Elias Monroe. He ranches the property adjoining yours to the east. He and your uncle had an informal agreement going back several years. Monroe's hands would help with the heavy work of harvest in exchange for water rights to the creek during the dry months. It was a neighborly arrangement, and it served them both well." Jennie asked if this Monroe was a man she could trust. Mr. Fitch looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that came as close to warmth as his professional disposition would allow. "In my experience of this county," he said, "Elias Monroe is about the most trustworthy thing in it." She took that to mean yes. She arranged for a room at the boarding house that sat behind the church, run by a widow named Mrs. Alderson, who had the arms of a woman who had been kneading bread for 50 years, and the eyes of a woman who had been watching other people's business for longer than that. Mrs. Alderson showed her to a clean room on the second floor with a window that looked south toward open land, and Jennie unpacked her cases and hung her dresses on the hooks behind the door and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and decided, in the way you decide things when you are not entirely sure you believe yourself, that she would stay through the harvest. She would see the wheat cut and sold. She would sign whatever else needed signing, settle the estate properly, and then she would decide whether to sell the property or find some other arrangement. It was a plan with a clear end to it. That clarity comforted her. She was a woman who liked to know when things were going to be finished. The next morning she hired a boy with a wagon to take her out to the property, and when she first saw the farmhouse, she understood immediately why Mr. Fitch had not described it in his letter. It was the kind of description that would have made her reconsider coming. The house was sound enough structurally. She could see that, 2 good rooms and a lean-to kitchen, with a porch that listed slightly to the left but had not yet decided to fall. But Uncle Harold had not been a man who troubled himself about paint or about the way weeds could take over a front step when you gave them any encouragement at all. The inside was dim and close and smelled of old pipe smoke, and the particular mustiness of rooms that have not had windows opened in them for a considerable length of time. She opened every window she could find. Then she walked around to the back of the house and stood looking east, across the field of winter wheat that stretched away from her in long, parallel rows of green gold, catching the morning light and moving in a slow, patient wave under a wind she could barely feel. It was, she thought, rather beautiful, more beautiful than she had been prepared for. She stood there for a long time looking at it. She was still standing there when she heard the sound of a horse approaching from the direction of the eastern fence line, and she turned to see a man coming across the field on a sorrel horse, picking his way carefully between the rows, guiding his animal with the small, practiced adjustments of someone who has been riding since, before thinking about it was necessary. He pulled up at the edge of the field and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and there was a moment that was purely animal in its directness. 2 people assessing each other across open ground with no social preamble to soften it. He was perhaps 28 or 29, lean in the way of men who work outdoors in all weather, with a face that was weathered without being hard, brown-eyed and dark-haired under a hat that had seen considerable service. He had the kind of jaw that suggested opinions held firmly, and the kind of eyes that suggested those opinions were arrived at carefully. He dismounted with a single fluid motion that had no performance in it whatsoever and led his horse forward by the reins. "Miss Garrison," he said. It was not a question. He had clearly been informed of her arrival. "That is me," she said, "and you would be Mr. Monroe." "Elias," he said. He did not say it with any particular insistence, simply with the ease of a man who found his own last name more formal than the situation required. He came a little closer and took off his hat. "I wanted to come introduce myself and offer my condolences about your uncle. Harold was a good neighbor." She thanked him. She asked him what kind of man Harold had been, because she found that she was genuinely curious in a way she had not expected to be. Elias Monroe was quiet for a moment in the way of someone assembling a true answer rather than a polite one. "Stubborn," he said, "careful with money, good with animals." He was not a man who talked much, but when he said something, he meant it. He paused. He was proud of this land. "I know he would want it cared for." Jennie looked back at the wheat field. "Mr. Fitch told me about the arrangement you had with him." "It still stands if you want it to," Elias said. "The wheat is healthy. It will be ready to cut in late June or early July, depending on what the weather does. My hands and I can manage the harvest. You will want to be here for it to understand what the yield is and to see the sale through properly." He said all of this in a straightforward, practical way, without any condescension or hurry. "But the arrangement and what comes after it are entirely up to you." She looked at him. She said, "I plan to stay through the harvest. After that I will make my decisions." He nodded, as if that were the most reasonable thing anyone had said to him in some time. "Then I will see you through it," he said simply. He put his hat back on. If you need anything in the meantime, my ranch house is about a mile east along the fence line. I have a foreman named Pete Cavanaugh who knows this property almost as well as I do. Either of us is available." He got back on his horse and rode back the way he had come, and Jennie watched him go. And then she turned back to the farmhouse because there was a great deal of cleaning to do, and she had not come all this way to stand in a field thinking about a man's jaw. She spent the first week putting the farmhouse in order with an intensity that surprised even her. She scrubbed the floors with water hauled from the creek, beat the dust out of the curtains, found that the stove worked perfectly well once she cleared its chimney of a bird's nest that must have been there since the previous summer, and discovered in the lean-to kitchen a cast iron skillet of such quality that she felt a small glow of satisfaction, the way you feel when something practical and good has survived neglect. She bought supplies from the general store in town, negotiating a credit arrangement with the storekeeper, a broad, cheerful man named Harmon, who seemed to find her entirely competent and treated her accordingly. She liked Millhaven for that. It was a working town, and working towns tended to judge people by what they could do rather than by the more elaborate social geometries of the city. Elias Monroe appeared at the edge of her property twice that first week, not in an intrusive way, but in the way of a neighbor who is keeping a general eye on things. The first time he brought her a side of bacon from his smokehouse and left it on her porch with no ceremony whatsoever. The second time he came by to check the irrigation ditch that ran along the south side of the wheat field and needed some repair before the drier months set in. He spent the better part of an afternoon working on it with Pete Cavanaugh, his foreman, a stocky, red-faced Irishman of about 50 who had a mustache of considerable ambition and a laugh like a barn door being thrown open. Pete clearly adored his employer with the comfortable, unsentimental devotion of a man who has worked alongside someone long enough to respect them properly. Jennie brought them water at midday. It was a natural thing to do, and she did it naturally, carrying out a bucket and a ladle, and the three of them stood in the sun by the irrigation ditch and drank. And Pete Cavanaugh told her 3 separate stories about the worst rainstorm he had ever seen, each story having apparently taken place in a different year and a different state, which did not seem to trouble him in the slightest. Elias listened to the stories with the patient amusement of someone who has heard them before and has not yet decided they need correcting. "You are settling in all right?" Elias asked her when Pete had gone back to the ditch. "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "I had not anticipated finding it pleasant." He looked at her with a directness that was not rude but was very present. "What had you anticipated?" she considered. "Obligation," she said. "I thought I was coming to discharge an obligation. And it does not feel like that." She looked out at the wheat, which shimmered in the afternoon heat with a quality that was almost musical. "Not exactly," she said. "Not anymore." He nodded slowly and said nothing more about it, and she thought that was one of the more considerable things about him, that he did not press. He asked a question, and he received the answer, and he let it be. She had spent enough time in rooms where every answer was a starting point for someone else's further opinion that she found his restraint almost disorienting in its pleasantness. In May the weather turned warm and stayed warm, and the wheat grew with a vigor that Elias told her was a good sign, that the rain in March had been well timed, and the soil her uncle had been working for 11 years was in excellent condition. He walked the field with her one evening after supper, both of them moving between the rows in the long, gold light of late afternoon, and he explained to her the things he saw in the wheat that she did not yet know how to read. He showed her how to pinch a head of wheat and rub it between her fingers to feel the progress of the grain. He showed her how the color was shifting from the deep green of full growth toward the golden tone that meant the plant was beginning to put its energy into the seed. "My father grew wheat in Ohio," she told him, because it seemed relevant, and also because she found herself wanting to tell him things which surprised her. "I remember the harvest when I was small, the noise of it, all the men." "Did you like it?" he asked. "I liked the end of it," she said. "When it was done and everyone was tired and satisfied, there was a particular smell in the evening after a day of cutting. I have not thought about that smell in years." He was quiet for a moment, walking beside her. The sun was behind them and their shadows went long in front of them over the wheat. "That smell comes back every year," he said. "It does not change." She believed him. She found that she believed most things he said, not because he was persuasive, but because he spoke with the particular quality of someone who does not say things unless they are true. June brought a complication in the form of a man named Dale Whitmore, who came to her door on a Thursday morning with a hat in his hands and a smile that was doing more work than a smile should have to do. He was a land speculator. She understood within approximately 3 minutes, though he introduced himself as a businessman with interests in agricultural development, which was the same thing dressed in better clothes. He was interested, he said, in her property. He was prepared to offer her a price that he described as generous, and that, when he named it, she recognized as somewhat below what the land would bring from a legitimate buyer who was not trying to capitalize on a woman recently arrived from the city who might not know its value. She thanked him and told him she was not ready to make any decisions about the property at this time. He came back the following Tuesday with a higher number and a friend he introduced as his associate, a man who stood in her doorway without removing his hat and looked around her kitchen in a manner that was meant to remind her of how much effort it was going to take to maintain this place. She thanked him again and told him again that she was not selling. She mentioned Whitmore's visits to Elias that weekend when he came by to check on the field. She mentioned it matter-of-factly, because she was not asking for his help, only reporting an event. Elias listened with his arms folded, and an expression that she had begun to recognize as the one he wore when he was deciding whether something warranted significant concern or merely mild concern. "Whitmore has been buying up land in this county for 3 years," he said. "He gets it cheap when he can and sells it to the railroad or to investors from back east. He is not dangerous exactly, but he is persistent, and he is not above making things difficult." "Things are not going to become difficult," Jennie said firmly. Elias looked at her. The corner of his mouth did something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "No," he said, "I do not expect they are." He did not volunteer to go confront Whitmore on her behalf, and she appreciated that more than she could easily have explained. He trusted her to handle her own business. He simply made sure she had the information she needed to do so. She wrote a letter to Mr. Fitch asking him to make official inquiries into the current market value of the property so that she would have an accurate number to refer to should Whitmore return. Mr. Fitch replied within the week with a figure that was considerably higher than anything Whitmore had offered. She filed this information away with satisfaction. Whitmore came one more time in late June, and she told him the number Mr. Fitch had provided, told it to him clearly and without heat, and watched his confident smile rearrange itself into something smaller and more honest. He left and did not come back, and she considered the matter settled. By late June, the wheat was moving from gold toward the dull, ripe amber that Elias had told her to watch for, and the air above the field had that specific dusty quality that preceded a harvest, a kind of suspended readiness, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Elias came by nearly every day now, sometimes to check the field, sometimes to consult with her about the logistics of the cutting, the hiring of additional hands, the arrangement with the grain buyer in Millhaven whose name was Foster, and who had a reputation, according to Pete Cavanaugh, of being honest to 3 decimal places on the weight but suspicious on the moisture content. Jennie had begun to look forward to these visits in a way that she examined carefully and then set aside to examine again later, when she was not in the middle of examining other things. The honest accounting she gave herself was this: she liked being in his company. She liked the particular quality of his attention, which was complete without being oppressive. She liked that he spoke to her about the wheat and the ditch and the grain buyer as though these were subjects she was capable of having informed opinions about, which she increasingly was, because she had been paying attention and asking questions, and he had been answering them without making her feel that the questions were unwelcome. She also found, in the still hours of the early morning when sleep had not yet come back after the birds woke her, that she thought about the way his hands looked when he was showing her something in the wheat field, the careful, precise way he would hold a head of grain or draw a mark in the dirt with a stick to illustrate the slope of a ditch. She thought about the way he laughed, which was infrequent enough to be notable and genuine enough to be worth waiting for. She thought about the fact that he smelled of horse and wood smoke and clean outdoor air, and that this combination, which she would not have predicted finding appealing in scent. Louis had become something she associated with ease and safety in a way that startled her when she thought about it directly. She did not tell him any of this. She was a practical woman and she had a plan, and the plan did not include complications. She was staying through the harvest. That was what she had decided. The harvest began on the 5th of July, 1882, and it came with all the noise and heat and organized chaos that Jennie had half remembered from childhood and found, now, to be exactly as she had remembered and also more. Elias brought 4 of his own hands, Pete Cavanaugh among them, and had arranged for 4 additional men from town, and they arrived before sunrise with the horse-drawn reaper and its attendant rattle and creak, and the field, which had been a thing of contemplative beauty for weeks, became something else entirely, something purposeful and loud and sweetly violent, the wheat falling in great, even swaths before the blade. Jennie worked alongside the men. This was not, she could tell, what some of them had expected, but she did not particularly care about their expectations. She learned quickly how to gather the fallen wheat into bundles of the right size and bind them with a handful of straw twisted at the waist, and she did this for hours in the heat until her arms ached in the particular way of new muscle work, and her dress was soaked through with effort and her hat had been given up entirely to a fence post sometime around noon. She brought water. She organized the midday meal that she had been preparing since the evening before, a quantity of salt pork and cornbread and cold beans that Mrs. Alderson had helped her plan with the practical efficiency of someone who had fed harvest crews before. Elias moved through the work with an authority that was never loud. He directed things with a word here and a nod there, shifted men from one task to another as the work evolved, kept the pace steady without pushing it past what the heat of the day would allow. He noticed when one of the town hands was flagging and put him on a lighter task without any comment that would embarrass him. He noticed when the reaper's blade wanted sharpening and had it done in the time it took the horses to be watered. He was extraordinarily good at this, she thought, watching him from across the field, this management of effort and people and animals and machinery all at once, the way a good conductor can hold an entire orchestra in their attention without appearing to. Late in the afternoon of the second day of harvest, when the western sky was going orange and the cut field had that clean, stripped look of accomplished work, Elias came and stood beside her where she was watching the last of the bundles being loaded onto the wagon. He was dusty and tired in the visible way of someone who has worked very hard and does not mind you seeing it. His hat was pushed back on his head and there was chaff in his hair. "You worked as hard as any man out there today," he said. There was nothing patronizing in it. He was simply stating something he had observed and considered worth saying. "It is my field," she said. "Yes," he agreed. And then, with a quality that was tentative in a way she had not heard from him before, he said, "Are you glad you came?" She looked at the field in the failing light, at the long, clean rows of stubble, at the wagon heavy with wheat. She thought about St. Louis. She thought about the painted watermill on the wall of her rented room, the water that never moved. She thought about the mornings here, the way the light came over the eastern fence line from the direction of his land, the way the air smelled of living things. "Yes," she said, and because that felt insufficient for what she actually meant, she said it again. "Yes, "I am very glad." He looked at her sideways in a way she had learned was his version of giving something full attention. He did not say anything else. But something between them shifted slightly, the way land shifts in spring, not with any drama, simply with the quiet acknowledgement of a new season. The wheat sold well. Foster, the grain buyer, was indeed honest on the weight, and Pete Cavanaugh's concerns about the moisture content proved to have been specific and personal, stemming from a disagreement they'd had 2 seasons prior that had apparently never been fully resolved. The final price per bushel was fair and the yield was good, and when Jennie sat down with the ledger and worked through the numbers, she found that the estate, including what the harvest had brought, was considerably more solvent than she had been led to expect by the general impression of neglect the property had given off when she first arrived. She had planned to stay through the harvest. The harvest was done. She sat on the porch of the farmhouse in the evening of the day she had completed the accounts and looked out at the cut field, which was silver in the moonlight, and she thought about what came next. She had assumed this thinking would be straightforward. She had assumed she would feel the pull of familiar things, of her life as she had previously arranged it. She had assumed she would know when she was ready to leave, because readiness to leave was a thing she had always previously been able to identify. She could not find it now. She tried to be precise about what she could and could not account for. She could account for the fact that the land was hers, and it was good land, and it was not unreasonable to want to keep it. She could account for the fact that she had found she was capable of things she had not known she was capable of, and that this discovery was difficult to simply walk away from. She could account for the fact that Millhaven, which had seemed so small and distant from the vantage point of St. Louis, had revealed itself to have the particular depth of a place where people knew each other and depended on each other and kept their word, and that this was not nothing. What she found more difficult to account for, to herself, and in the clear terms she preferred, was Elias Monroe. She thought about the water he had left on her porch when she had forgotten to bring enough back from the creek. She thought about the afternoon 2 weeks ago when she had found a lame horse wandering her south fence line and had not known what to do with it. And she had gone to find Elias, and he had come back with her and spent an hour with the animal, gentle and unhurried, until it let him see what was wrong. And then he had told her the horse was going to be fine and taken it back to his place to recover. She thought about the conversations they had standing in the field in the long summer evenings. Conversations that had started out being about wheat and water rights and grain prices, and had become, without any particular design, conversations about Ohio and about his own history, about his father who had ranched in Texas, and from whom he had learned the work he now did, about his mother who had died when he was 15, and whom he clearly still missed in the way of something that had not been finished. She thought about the way those conversations felt, the way they had an ease and a substance that she had not often found in conversations with anyone. She was not a person who confused sentiment for something else. She knew what she was feeling. She was feeling something rather large and rather specific, something she had not felt with any urgency since she was 19, and had let a man with excellent manners and no substance take up approximately 8 months of her life that she would not have back. The difference, she thought, sitting on the porch in the moonlight, was that Elias Monroe was entirely substantial. He was the most substantial person she had encountered in a long time, and she was frightened of it in the way you are frightened of things that matter. She did not go to him. She went to Mrs. Alderson. She appeared at the boarding house on a Saturday morning with what she recognized was not entirely a casual expression on her face, and Mrs. Alderson, who was as perceptive as she was bread-armed, took one look at her, set her down at the kitchen table, poured coffee, and said, "All right then." Jennie told her, not all of it but the essential shape of it. She told her that she had intended to leave after the harvest, and that she did not seem to be leaving, and that she was not entirely certain how much of that was about the land, and how much of it was about a particular man who ranched to the east of her property. Mrs. Alderson listened the way she did everything, thoroughly and without fuss. Then she said, "What does he do that troubles you?" Jennie thought about this. "Nothing," she said. "That is rather the point. He does not rush me. He does not tell me what I should decide. He is just there, present. And I cannot tell if he feels what I think he might feel because he is so careful about not imposing." Mrs. Alderson drank her coffee. "Elias Monroe," she said, as though confirming something she already knew, "has been carrying something quiet around since his father died 2 winters ago. He took over that ranch entirely himself, built it up, does not complain about it. He is a careful man with his own feelings, yes, but I have seen that man look at you across the church steps twice now, and I will tell you that a careful man looking at someone like that is not a man who feels nothing." Jennie sat with that for a moment. "You think I should tell him?" "I think," Mrs. Alderson said, with the authority of someone who has lived long enough to have seen a considerable number of people make the mistake of not saying the necessary thing, "that you should stop planning around him and start talking to him." She thought about it for 3 more days, which she recognized as 2 days longer than it needed to take. On the 4th day she walked east along the fence line to his ranch house. The Monroe Ranch was larger than she had imagined, a proper working operation with a barn of considerable size, a bunkhouse for the hands, a well-kept yard, and a house that was simple but solid, built to last rather than to impress. There was a garden on the south side of the house that she had not expected, late summer tomatoes and squash coming along under careful attention, and the sight of it did something to her heart that she could not immediately categorize. A man who kept a garden in the middle of cattle country was a man who believed in tending things. She found him at the corral, working with a young horse that was still uncertain about being handled, moving around it with that same quiet patience she had seen him apply to every problem, giving it room and then less room, never forcing, waiting for the animal to accept him. He saw her coming from some distance away, and he kept working, but he tracked her progress with that same sideways attention she had learned to read. When she reached the corral fence, he stopped and came to her, looping his reins over the post. He read her face, she could see him do it, and something in his expression became very still and very careful. "I have not left," she said, because she had decided on the way over that she would start with what was simply true and let the rest follow. "No," he agreed, "you have not. I had planned to leave after the harvest." "I know. I am not planning it anymore." She held his gaze, which required something of her, because his eyes were very direct and she was saying something that felt enormous in the still morning air. "I have been trying to work out why, and I have arrived at a conclusion that involves you, and I wanted to be honest about it rather than simply staying without telling you." He was very quiet. The young horse moved behind him and he did not look at it. "What conclusion is that?" he asked, and his voice was careful and low and not casual at all. "That I would like to know you better," she said. "That I would like the chance to find out what this is, what I think it might be." She stopped. Then, because she was Jennie Garrison and she had driven across the state for this conversation, and she was not going to lose her nerve at the critical moment, she said, "I think I am falling in love with you. I wanted you to know that before I decided to stay, so that you could tell me if that changes anything about whether my staying is welcome." She watched him. She watched the stillness in him gather itself into something that was not stillness at all, but rather the opposite, a kind of contained intensity that, when it finally moved, moved all at once. He said, "Jennie." He said it the way you say someone's name when you have been keeping it in your mouth quietly for a while, and you have finally been given permission to speak it aloud. He said, "I have been trying to give you room to make your own choices. I did not want you to stay for any reason except the right ones." "I know that," she said. "I need you to understand," he said, with the precise care of a man who has thought about this, "that I wanted you to stay. I have wanted it since probably the first week you were here. I did not say so because it was not my place to say so. You had decisions to make and they were yours." She felt something ease in her chest that she had not quite known was held tight. "It would have been easier," she said, with something that was almost a laugh, "if you had said something sooner." "Would it?" he asked. And she considered it and understood that it would not have been easier at all, that she had needed to arrive here on her own terms, and that his patience had been one of the things that had, in fact, made her sure. "No," she admitted. "You were right not to." He reached across the fence rail and took her hand, and it was the first time he had touched her deliberately, and she thought she had perhaps been looking forward to it in some part of herself that she had been politely ignoring for about 2 months. His hand was warm and roughened and entirely certain. "Then we are in agreement," he said. "We are in agreement," she said. They stood there in the morning sun with their hands linked across the corral fence, and the young horse behind him blew out a breath and shook its head, and somewhere from the direction of the barn Pete Cavanaugh appeared with a bucket and stopped dead when he saw them, and then turned around and went back the way he came with an immediacy that suggested he had understood the situation perfectly and was going to give it the appropriate amount of privacy. In August, Jennie made her decision formal. She visited Mr. Fitch and told him she was keeping the property and would not be entertaining any further offers from Mr. Whitmore or anyone like him. Mr. Fitch wrote this down with his careful pen and looked at her over his spectacles in a manner that suggested he had already suspected as much and was not displeased. She wrote to her former landlady in St. Louis to retrieve the few things she had left in storage there, a box of books and her grandmother's quilting frame, and she arranged to have them shipped by rail to Wichita and from Wichita to Millhaven by freight wagon. She also wrote to a woman she had been friends with since childhood, a schoolteacher named Ruth Hayward, to tell her what had happened and what she had decided. Ruth wrote back a letter of 12 pages that contained, in roughly equal proportion, enthusiasm, concern, a great many questions, and a series of opinions about the romantic temperament that were largely generated by Ruth's own considerable experience of the subject. Elias came by most evenings in August, in the comfortable and gradually more open way of two people who have acknowledged something and are now learning its dimensions. They ate supper together on her porch more often than not, simple meals because neither of them needed anything elaborate, and they talked in the way that had always characterized their conversations, but was now less careful, less boundaried, more willing to go wherever it went. He told her about growing up on his father's cattle operation in Texas, about learning the land and the work before he had learned most everything else, about the decision to come to Kansas when he was 22 with what money he had saved, and the specific, hard-won knowledge of how to run a ranch, and no guarantee whatsoever that the venture would succeed. She told him about her mother, who had died when Jennie was 16, and about how she had managed on her own in St. Louis, and what that had taught her about her own capability and also about loneliness, which were not, she said, entirely separate lessons. She told him about the year she had spent trying to be the kind of woman the city expected her to be before she had given that up and simply been herself, which was more practical and considerably more comfortable. He listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, as if each piece mattered and was worth understanding. They went riding together on Sunday afternoons, when the week's work was done, and the land had the particular holiday quality of rest. He had a horse for her, a roan mare named Scout who was opinionated but not difficult, and they rode out across the open country east of his ranch, up into the low hills where you could see for 30 miles on a clear day in every direction. She had grown up in Ohio and then lived in St. Louis, and she had never understood before what it meant to see that far. It changed something in the architecture of your expectations. It made you understand that there was always more country than you thought, and that this was not a frightening thing but a generous one. On one of these Sunday rides they crested a low hill and stopped and looked out over the long, golden sweep of the prairie in the late afternoon light, and he said, without preamble, "I would like to ask you something." She looked at him. "Then ask it. Are you happy here?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The light was doing something extraordinary to the grass, making it look almost lit from within, and the sky above them was the particular blue of September in Kansas, deep and certain. "Yes," she said, "more than I expected to be anywhere." "Good," he said. And then, after a pause that had a weight to it, "I am going to ask you to marry me. Not today. I want to say that first, so you know it is coming, so you have time to think about it on your own terms. But I wanted you to know." She turned to look at him fully. He was looking at her with an expression that was open and serious and entirely without artifice, and she thought that this was perhaps the most characteristic thing he had ever done. This announcement of an intention in advance so that she could be prepared, so that it would not come at her as a surprise she had to respond to without time to think. He was, to his bones, a man who gave people room. "That is a very particular way to propose," she said. "I am a particular person," he said, without apology. She laughed, a real laugh startled out of her by the precision of it. "Yes," she said, "you are." She paused. "I appreciate the warning." They rode back in the long light, and she thought about it, and she did not need as long as he had given her. She went to him the following Thursday. She found him in the barn, where he was mending a piece of tack with the meticulous attention to detail that was simply part of how he approached every task. He looked up when she came in, and she saw in his expression that he understood she had come for a reason. "Yes," she said. He set down the tack. He stood up. He looked at her for a long, still moment, and then he smiled, and it was the same smile she had been accumulating instances of since May, each one rarer and more precise than the last, and this one was the finest she had yet seen, open and unhurried and completely genuine, transforming his careful face into something that was not careful at all. "Yes," he said back, and it held everything. He crossed the barn to her and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was somehow also decisive, and he kissed her in the dim, hay-smelling barn, while the afternoon light came through the slats in long, gold bars. And she thought, clearly, and with a satisfaction that reached all the way to the practical core of her, that she had been entirely right to stay. They were married in October, in Millhaven's small white church with the peeling paint, which someone had organized a community effort to repaint in the weeks preceding the wedding, partly as a general gesture of civic improvement and partly, Jennie suspected, because the women of the town had decided that if there was going to be a wedding, the church was going to look appropriate for it. Mrs. Alderson organized the reception with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and Pete Cavanaugh wore a suit that had clearly been acquired for the occasion, and spent the entire celebration attempting to look as though wearing suits was something he did regularly, which fooled no one. Jennie wore her mother's wedding brooch pinned to a dress of ivory lawn that she and Mrs. Alderson had spent 2 weeks constructing from fabric ordered from Wichita, and Elias wore a dark coat and his best boots, and looked at her walking down the aisle of the small, freshly painted church, as though the entire rest of the world had temporarily ceased to require his attention. The minister, a thin man of considerable conviction named Pastor Deakins, performed the ceremony with moving brevity and quiet dignity, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, there was a sound from the assembled congregation that was partly a cheer and partly something quieter and more genuine, the sound of people who are glad to witness something that is clearly right. They walked out into the October sunlight together, and the day was one of those crystalline autumn days that Kansas produced as if to compensate for its more difficult weather in other seasons, the air sharp and clean, and the sky an impossible blue, the cottonwoods along the creek showing yellow, and the cut fields lying quiet and ready, the land going into the restful patience of winter. "Well," Elias said, standing on the church steps with her hand in his, looking out at the familiar street of Millhaven, at the storefronts and the water tower and the grain elevator, all of it ordinary and entirely his. "Well," she agreed. He looked at her. "Are you glad you stayed?" She had answered this question before in different forms, but she found she did not mind answering it again. She thought of the letter she had read 3 times on a Tuesday in April in a rented room in St. Louis. She thought of the painted mill and its water that never moved. She thought of standing behind the farmhouse looking at the wheat for the first time, the way it moved in the wind, that slow and patient wave. "I am so very glad I stayed," she said, and she meant it in all the ways it was possible to mean something. They settled into a life together with the practical ease of two people who have taken their time about this and know what they are doing. Jennie kept her farmhouse as a proper part of their combined operation, converting Harold's 2 main fields to a rotation that Elias helped her plan for maximum yield over multiple seasons, planting corn in one and leaving the other to grow back in cover crop for a year to restore the soil. She expanded the kitchen garden behind the house and found, somewhat to her own amusement, that she was becoming a person who talked about soil drainage and seed varieties with genuine passion, which was not something she had expected of herself in the years she spent in St. Louis. She also discovered that she was a better rider than she had given herself credit for, that Scout the roan mare had decided to be cooperative in proportion to the amount of trust extended to her, and that the Sunday rides into the hills had become one of the fixed pleasures of her week in a way that felt essential rather than optional. The winter of 1882 came early and hard, the kind of hard that the plains did so thoroughly, with a weeks-long cold snap in December that kept the horses inside and the hands close to the bunkhouse stove and made the world go very white and very quiet. Jennie found she did not mind the winter. She minded it far less than she had expected, in part because the farmhouse was warm, and she knew it was warm because she had made it so, caulked and sealed and properly stacked with wood, and in part because Elias was there, coming in from the cold each evening with the particular relief of a man who has been doing necessary things outdoors and is now glad to be inside, and she found that she liked this specific version of his presence, the indoor winter version, which was easier and more expansive than she had expected from a man so thoroughly of the outdoors. He read in the evenings when there was enough light, practical things mostly, almanacs and farming periodicals, and the occasional report from the state agricultural office. But also, she discovered one evening, a volume of poetry that he had acquired at some point and kept on the shelf above his desk with a casualness that suggested he would prefer it not be remarked upon. She remarked upon it. He looked at her with a guarded expression for a moment, and then, apparently deciding that she had demonstrated sufficient trustworthiness to be told the truth, acknowledged that he had been reading poetry since he was approximately 15 and had found it useful for reasons he had difficulty explaining in prose. She found this extremely endearing and told him so directly, and he laughed the good, genuine laugh that she had been accumulating and adding to her collection since May, and she thought that there were going to be entire shelves of these moments by the time she was old, and she looked forward to every one of them. In the spring of 1883, she planted her first full season of wheat on the home field with full confidence in what she was doing, ordering seed through Harmon at the general store, preparing the soil herself with help from 2 of Elias' hands, timing the planting to the last frost date she had carefully tracked through the previous autumn. Elias watched her manage this with a quiet satisfaction that he expressed by helping when she asked him to and staying out of the way when she did not, which was exactly the balance she needed. Pete Cavanaugh, who had initially been uncertain about the wisdom of a woman from St. Louis taking on a Kansas wheat operation, had by this point become her enthusiastic advocate, a shift that had occurred sometime around the previous harvest when he had watched her negotiate with Foster the grain buyer with a precise and cheerful firmness that had secured them an extra cent per bushel, which Pete had announced to the assembled hands as evidence of something he already believed about women who did their research. Millhaven itself was growing in the small, incremental way of a prosperous agricultural town. A second dry goods store opened at the north end of Main Street. The school, which had been operating out of a room above the livery stable for 2 years, got its own building in the spring of 1883, a clean frame structure with 2 rooms and a proper blackboard, and the school board hired a teacher who came from Topeka and was young and energetic, and had the strong opinions about education that Jennie found entirely admirable. She became involved with the school board herself, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had opinions about what a school should do for the children of a working community, and she had found that Millhaven was a place where opinions accompanied by effort were welcome. She wrote to her friend Ruth Hayward again in the spring of 1883, a long letter that covered the wheat planting and the school board and the winter in Elias, in approximately that order, and then she went back and rewrote it with the sections on Elias considerably more prominent, because she recognized that she had been attempting a level of restraint that was not honest. Ruth wrote back a letter that was 14 pages and contained considerably more enthusiasm than concern, which Jennie read aloud to Elias on the porch one evening, with selective editing that he recognized for what it was and accepted with amusement. By midsummer, she knew she was expecting a child, and she sat with this knowledge for 3 quiet days before she told Elias, not because she had any doubt about his response, but because she wanted those 3 days to herself, to feel the fullness of it privately before it became something shared. She had learned enough about herself in the past year to know that this was simply how she worked, that she needed to inhabit things on her own terms before she opened them out. She told him on an evening in July, sitting on the porch in the warm dark with the fireflies doing their intermittent business in the grass beyond the fence. She said it plainly, the way she said most important things. He went very still in the way that she had learned meant he was taking something in fully and not going to speak until he had. Then he turned to her, and in the dim light from the window, his expression was everything she had hoped for and more, not just glad but something deeper, something that suggested this mattered to him in a way he was going to need time to put into words. He did not try to put it into words immediately. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat there together in the warm Kansas dark and listened to the night sounds, the crickets and the horses and the distant, soft wind in the grass, and she thought that this was perhaps the quietest and most complete happiness she had ever felt. The winter wheat of 1883 went into the ground in September, timed and placed with everything Jennie had learned from her first full cycle of the land. She managed the planting herself with a confidence that was entirely earned, reading the soil and the weather and the seed with a practiced eye. And then she watched the green shoots come up in October with the private satisfaction of someone who knows she has done a thing well. Their son was born in February of 1884, in the farmhouse where Jennie had scrubbed the floors on her first week in Millhaven, with Mrs. Alderson in attendance and the doctor from town, a steady, capable man named Dr. Holt, who had been delivering babies on the Kansas frontier for 15 years and approached the work with the calm competence of long practice. The birth was hard in the way that births were, long and exhausting and requiring of her every reserve of will she possessed, but when it was over she held her son and looked at him with a complete astonishment that she did not think would ever fully wear off. This specific person who had arrived from somewhere impossible and was now entirely himself, already insisting on the world with a voice of considerable volume. Elias sat with her while she held the baby, close beside her on the edge of the bed, and she showed him his son and watched his face do something that she had never seen it do before, something utterly unguarded and open, something that had no words for it in any of the languages she knew. He reached out one careful finger and the baby gripped it with the fierce, automatic certainty of the newborn, and Elias laughed, a sound so full and undefended that she would remember it for the rest of her life. They named him Harold for her uncle, who had after all set all of this in motion with his letter and his land, and his inconvenient death in March of 1882. It seemed right to Jennie to honor that, and Elias agreed with the thoughtfulness of someone who understood that things come from other things, and that the origins of your life deserve acknowledgement. Harold Monroe was a substantial baby and grew into a substantial child, wide-shouldered and brown-eyed like his father, and stubborn in a way that left Jennie with no option but to recognize her own contribution. He walked early and talked late, and made up for the talking with a comprehensive physical engagement with the world that kept everyone around him fully occupied. Pete Kavanaugh appointed himself the boy's unofficial second education, teaching him things about horses and rope, and the general management of stubborn animals that Pete felt were not receiving sufficient emphasis in formal instruction. The harvest of 1884 was the best Jennie's land had produced in what Mr. Fitch told her was several years. The combination of her careful soil management, and a good season of rain, and the accumulated knowledge she had brought to the planting having produced a yield that had Pete Kavanaugh doing arithmetic with visible pleasure. Foster the grain buyer was honest on the weight, and she was firm on the price, and they arrived at a figure that she considered appropriate and wrote down in her ledger with satisfaction. Elias expanded his cattle operation that year, buying additional stock from a rancher south of Wichita who was retiring and had a herd of good quality. The Monroe Ranch was prospering with the particular soundness of an operation that has been built on knowledge and patience rather than speculation. The county was filling up, more settlers coming in each year, more farms being claimed and worked, and there were sometimes difficulties that came with growth, disputes over water and fences and cattle that crossed lines they should not have crossed, and these were generally resolved through the county's own mechanisms of mediation and law, though not always without friction. Elias was respected in these disputes as a fair voice, a man whose judgment other men trusted, because he had demonstrated over years that he did not put his thumb on a scale. Jennie became increasingly involved in the civic life of Millhaven in these years, her school board work expanding into broader questions about what the town needed and what it was capable of being. She was direct in meetings, and people had learned to listen to her, because she tended to have done the work necessary to speak to a subject before she spoke to it. She was also, she was told, occasionally alarming to people who expected her to be more deferential, which she took as a mild and acceptable cost of being herself. She corresponded regularly with Ruth Hayward, who finally, in the spring of 1885, made good on her repeated promises to come visit, arriving by train to Wichita and then by coach to Millhaven with 3 traveling cases, and an energy that filled the farmhouse from the moment she stepped through the door. Ruth was small and quick, and had opinions about everything with a generosity that was completely genuine, and she and Elias took an immediate and sincere liking to each other based on their shared quality of meaning what they said, which Jennie observed with satisfaction. Ruth stayed for 3 weeks and spent a considerable portion of them demanding detailed accounts of every aspect of the previous 3 years, while sitting on Jennie's porch in the evenings, and she left having formed strong positive views about Kansas, about wheat farming, about Elias Monroe in particular, and about the general proposition that people sometimes end up exactly where they are supposed to be through paths they could not have predicted from the beginning. In the summer of 1885, Jennie found herself expecting again, and this time she told Elias the same evening she knew, without the 3 days of private preparation, because she found that it was simply natural to tell him, that the private territory between them had shifted and deepened to the point where holding something to herself felt different than it used to, felt less like ownership of an experience, and more like withholding from the person she was most herself with. He was just as glad the second time. Perhaps, she thought, more glad, because he knew now what it meant in a way that only experience can teach you. Their daughter was born in March of 1886, and they named her Clara, for Elias' mother whom he had told Jennie about on one of their first long evening conversations, The woman who had died when he was 15 and who had, he said, been the kind of person you measure everything by afterward. Clara Monroe arrived in the world with a precision that her elder brother had entirely lacked. A small and observant infant who regarded the people around her with an expression of considered evaluation that Jennie found extremely familiar, and that made Elias laugh every time he caught it. Harold, who was 2.5 and had opinions about most things, received his sister with an enthusiasm that required monitoring. He wanted to carry her. He wanted to show her the barn. He wanted to introduce her to the horses. These ambitions were managed with patience and firmness by a united front that Jennie thought was perhaps the most effective collaboration she and Elias had yet produced, and Harold gradually accepted that his sister required a somewhat longer runway before the barn could be part of her life. The years moved with the particular quality of full years, each one containing enough of everything that they seemed simultaneously long and brief when looked back on. The wheat came up and was harvested and came up again. The cattle on the Monroe ranch increased and were sold, and the money went back into the operation with the sound logic of someone building for the long term. Harold grew with an urgency that suggested he wanted to be finished with childhood as efficiently as possible, and Clara grew with a thoughtfulness that suggested she was finding it worth taking her time about. And both of them learned the land from both their parents in the way of children who grow up working alongside the adults they love, by doing and by watching and by asking questions that sometimes had better answers than the adults had expected. Pete Cavanaugh, who was in his late 50s now, and had somehow accumulated 20 additional stories about the worst rainstorm he had ever seen, remained a fixture of the operation and of the household, appearing for supper several times a week with the ease of someone who has been doing this long enough that it has become simply a fact of life. He had a particular fondness for Clara that he expressed through the construction of small wooden animals of surprising quality, which appeared on the farmhouse windowsill at irregular intervals, and which Clara received with the grave seriousness of someone who understood they were worth something. In the spring of 1888, Harold turned 4 and announced to Pete Cavanaugh that he intended to learn to rope properly. Not the preliminary version Pete had been teaching him, but the real thing. And Pete received this announcement with an expression that suggested he found it the most reasonable ambition a child had ever expressed to him, and immediately set about making it possible. Jennie watched her son in the corral with his rope and his enormous determination, and the patient instruction of a man who had clearly been waiting for exactly this conversation for some time. And she thought about how life arranged itself into things that were exactly right in ways you could not have planned for. She thought about this often, in the way you think about the long shape of things when you have been somewhere long enough to see a shape forming. She had planned to stay through the harvest. One harvest, the harvest of one field, a temporary arrangement with a clear endpoint. And instead here she was, 6 years later, with the land deep in her and 2 children who had been born of it, and a man beside her who had known from the beginning that her choices were hers to make, and had waited with a patience that was not passive but active. That was its own form of faith. She went looking for him one afternoon in the spring of 1888, when the wheat was coming up in the home field in that fresh, insistent green that still moved her after 6 seasons of watching it. And she found him where she often found him, at the eastern fence line where his property met hers, looking out over both lands with the proprietorial satisfaction of someone who has built something worth looking at. She came and stood beside him. They stood there for a while without talking, the way they did easily, the way long familiarity allows. "Do you remember the first time I stood in this field?" she said. "You were looking at the wheat," he said. "You had no idea I was coming across the field until my horse was close. I was thinking about whether to stay," she said. He looked at her. "Were you, that first day?" "I was thinking about the painting on my landlady's wall in St. Louis," she said. "A mill, the water was painted and never moved. I was thinking that I had perhaps been living like something painted." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the field, at the living wheat moving in the spring wind. "And now," he said. She looked out with him. She thought about the answer with the care the question deserved, the same care she had always tried to bring to things that mattered. She thought about every harvest. She thought about every conversation on the porch in the warm dark. She thought about his hands and his laugh, and the garden on the south side of the house that had expanded every year. She thought about Harold in the corral with his rope and Clara on the windowsill cataloging her wooden animals. She thought about Mrs. Alderson and Pete Cavanaugh and Ruth Hayward's 14-page letters and the school board, and Foster the grain buyer and the specific blue of the Kansas sky in September. She thought about the woman who had stood in a rented room in St. Louis reading a letter 3 times, a woman who had a plan with a clear end to it, a woman who had been about to go discharge an obligation and come home. She took Elias' hand. "Now I am exactly where the water moved to," she said. He looked at her, and the afternoon light was on his face, and he was entirely present the way he had always been, patient and real and utterly certain of her. He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, which was a thing he did sometimes, quietly and without ceremony, as if this specific gesture was simply part of his private language for what she meant to him. The wheat moved around them in the spring wind, the same wave she had stood watching on her very first morning at this land, patient and endless and golden, and the sky went wide above them in every direction, and the world was so much larger and more full than the painted mill on the wall had ever suggested it could be. She had planned to stay only through the harvest. She had stayed through 6 harvests, and she intended to stay through every one that followed, through as many seasons as the land and the years would give her, through every crop that came up and every summer that ripened, and every autumn that turned the cottonwoods yellow along the creek, through the growth of her children and the deepening of the years, and all the ordinary and extraordinary specific texture of a life built here, on this land, beside this man. She had not been rushed into any of it, not by him. Not by the land itself, which had simply waited with the patient certainty of things that have been waiting a long time and know how to do it. She had made every choice on her own terms and at her own pace, and this was, she understood now, part of why the choices had the depth they did, part of why they held. The weeks turned into months and the months into the easy rounds of seasons, and Harold Monroe grew into a boy who could rope and ride with the natural authority of someone who has been learning since before they knew it. And Clara Monroe grew into a child of such composed intelligence that her teacher, the young woman from Topeka, sent a note home saying she had never had a student quite like her, which Elias read and set down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the complicated, proud way of a father encountering evidence that his child is going to be more remarkable than even he had expected. Pete Cavanaugh reached 60 years old in the autumn of 1888 and was given a celebration by the hands and the household that he endured with tremendous dignity, and approximately 3 speeches about the worst rainstorm he had ever seen, each from a different decade of his life. And then he sat on the porch in the quiet afterward and told Elias that he considered this the best cattle operation in the county, and he intended to keep working it until he fell off a horse, which Elias received with the equanimity of a man who has long since accepted that Pete Cavanaugh was going to do what Pete Cavanaugh was going to do. The winter of 1888 was milder than the winter of 1882 had been, and they sat through the quiet months with the accumulated ease of a household that knew its own rhythms. Elias read his poetry in the evenings and no longer looked up with a guarded expression when Jennie caught him at it. Harold asked for books about horses and got them, and read them with an intensity that suggested reading might be useful if it produced information about horses. Clara asked for books about everything, which were obtained and read and discussed with an appetite that showed no sign of slowing. Jennie continued her school board work and her correspondence with Ruth, who had by now visited twice more and sent letters at regular intervals full of the particular blend of enthusiasm and incisive observation that Jennie had valued in her since they were girls together in Ohio. In the spring of 1889, when the wheat was going in for the 7th consecutive year, Jennie stood in the home field with her hands in the earth and felt the soil between her fingers with the practiced recognition of long knowing. And she thought that there was a particular kind of wealth that had nothing to do with what Foster paid per bushel, though that mattered too, and everything to do with this, with the specific knowledge of a specific piece of land, with the understanding of what it needed and what it could give back, with the relationship between a person and a place that develops over years the way all real relationships develop, through attention and care and the willingness to be changed by what you find. She looked east toward the fence line and Elias land beyond it. She thought about the letter that had come on a Tuesday in April in 1882 and the decision she had made with a clarity she did not quite feel. She thought about a plan with a clear end to it. She thought about what it was to have your plans quietly and completely exceeded. She was 31 years old and she had found the country she was meant for, the work she was meant for, the man she was meant for, and none of it had been what she had set out to find. She had set out to discharge an obligation and come home. Instead, the obligation had turned out to be a gift, and home had turned out to be something she discovered rather than something she had left behind. She put the seeds into the earth with careful, deliberate hands, one after another, moving down the row in the old rhythm, and the sun was on her back, and the air was warm and alive with the particular smell of Kansas spring. And somewhere to the east, she could hear Elias' voice carrying across the field as he spoke to one of his hands, and further away the sound of Harold in the corral and the patient instruction of Pete Cavanaugh. And she understood with a completeness that had no doubts in it and no edges left unresolved that this was her life, all of it, the whole full weight and gift of it, and she would not have traded a single Tuesday letter or dusty coach ride or hard harvest day or long prairie winter of it for anything the painted world had ever offered her. The wheat went into the ground. It would come up. It always did. And she would be here to watch it, as she had been every year since she had first stood in this field, as she would be for every year the land continued to ask it of her, rooted here in the good Kansas earth as surely and as willingly as anything that grows.